Hi, this is Vicki Robinson, and today I'm going to show you how you can digitally tear a piece of paper so you can add a torn paper effect to your digital scrapbooking page or element. Let's get started. So today I'm working in Photoshop Elements 2022. These same steps will work in any version of Photoshop Elements and that has layer masks. So really old versions, before I think version 9, I don't think they had layer masks there. But so as long as you have a layer mask in Photoshop Elements, this will work. And of course, in the full version of Photoshop, the steps are the same. So I've got this paper here, and what I want to do is I want to tear an edge off here so that you see some of the brown paper below. I'm going to show you how to do this so that we can actually create a mask so that you can do this in the future just by clipping your paper to the mask rather than actually altering this particular paper. So let's go ahead and hide my paper layer here. I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm coming to the menu and choosing Edit, Fill Layer. We're going to say with color, and from the color picker I'm going to choose white. We don't need to say fill transparency, preserve transparency, because there's nothing there we want to keep, and say OK. Now we need to give this paper a little bit of texture. If you were really tearing a piece of paper, there would be some texture to it. It wouldn't be a plain white. So we're going to come to the menu and choose Filter, Noise, Add Noise. We're going to choose amount of 10. Distribution is going to be Gaussian, and then check monochromatic and say OK. Now this is a little bit too textured for me, so we're going to come to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we're going to add just a 1 pixel blur. And you can see that softened it a little bit. It looks a little bit more like paper. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our tear. We're going to take the lasso tool, and if you don't see it, it's nested with the magnetic or the polygonal lasso tool. But choose a lasso tool. Want to make sure that it's set to new. Feather is set to 0. And I'm just going to click up here and drag out, not a straight line, just sort of like if I was trying to tear it. And then because I'm creating a mask, I'm going to click all the way over to the left, come all the way around my paper, all the way out, come all the way back to my beginning point so that we close my tear. What I want to do is I want to make sure that this center part here is what is going to be my mask for my paper in the future. So I needed to go to the left to select all of that paper. Now that I've got that done, I'm going to click on the Create New Layer Mask icon. And as you can see, my tear is now masked because you can see my brown paper peeking through. Now this is way too solid. A tear would not be quite as smooth. So we're going to work on that by coming up to the filter menu. I've still got my layer selected with my tear in it. Filter menu. We're going to come to brush strokes, and we're going to come to spatter. And what this is going to do is it's going to rough up the edges of this paper just a tiny bit. Now the settings that you use might be different. You can experiment to see what you like the look of most. I just want sort of a rough little edge here, and I ended up with 17 as a spray radius and the smoothness of 11. The further to the right you go, the smoother it is. You're back to a smooth cut, and it just wouldn't look that way. So play with this number till you get it the way you want to. I've got right now, let's say 17 and 9, and say OK. So if we zoom in here, you can see sort of a rough paper cut here, okay? So that looks good. Let's move it below my paper, turn my paper on, and then attach my paper. I'm going to create a clipping mask. Right mouse click on the paper layer and say Layer, Create Clipping Mask. So the only part that's missing now is if you were to actually tear the paper, you'd see some of that white edge peeking through, right? So in order to create that, we're just going to duplicate my tear layer, right mouse click and say duplicate, or Control or Command J. And selecting the bottom layer, the original one down here, Control or Command T to get the transform handles. And now we're going to click and drag just slightly, maybe just slightly to the outside here, so that you start to see that white tear peeking through. So that looks, oops, come back here. That looks pretty good. Now, if you have Photoshop Elements 2022 or later, you'll have access to a warp tool. You'd find that under Image Transform Warp. That was just added in 2022, so the earlier versions won't have that. But now you can take these handles and maybe pull it out a little bit more here, maybe push it in and up a little bit here, adjust that to your liking. And of course, you could add a small drop shadow to the bottom of this. Come into Styles. This is going to be way too big, but let's apply this. Okay, fine. Come back over here, open up this style, and clearly we need to make this much smaller and drop the opacity way down. Paper on paper would just have a really light shadow. So you see that's okay, and it looks a little bit more like paper here than you would get if you just used a solid white. Let me show you here that, let me show you again. I have a piece of watercolor paper. I used that instead. I didn't go through that filter process. I just brought in a piece of watercolor paper and did my tear on that. And I think that looks even more natural to me there. So there's a quick way. And now, of course, you've got your mask, so you can save this file as a PSD file, save as a PSD, and then anytime you want to add this tear to a piece of paper, you can just open up the file, create a clipping mask with your paper, and actually we could just get rid of this right here, and then you can use that way, okay? Let me show you one other thing though, because there is something else you might want to do. Let's say you wanted to have this paper heart look like it is torn out of a piece of paper. Let's do this. Let's duplicate this. I just drew a heart shape here in Elements. Let's duplicate this layer, Control or Command J, and let's hide the top layer, and let's fill this with white. Edit, Fill Layer. I'm going to choose Color and White, all the way up in the upper left-hand corner. This time I'm going to say Preserve Transparency because I only want it to fill in the heart shape, and say OK. So once again, this doesn't look particularly real to me. So we could come back and say Filter, Noise, Add Noise. The settings that you just applied before will still be there. And then remember we did Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, 1 pixel. That's still there, say OK. So it's not exactly what you want, but it's close. Now what I would do from this point on is, this is just too stark. You know what, let's add a new layer and let's fill this layer with black. What I would do here is I would refine this even more. So I'm going to come over to my brushes. Using this, I said brush, what I meant to say is eraser. We want to erase. And choose the eraser, and then come back the rough round bristle from the default brushes. Now I'm going to slowly erase around here because I want this to look a little bit torn. You want to do this slowly, and you want to do it in pieces, because if you go too far, so what I'm doing is I'm lifting my brush, my mouse, every little bit, because if I go too far, I can always Control or Command Z to undo. But if you do too much at once, you might end up having to undo way more than you really want to spend the time doing. So I'm just doing small strokes here. That was a little too much. Now here's what I mean. Control or Command Z to undo, and I can come back and fix down here. A little bit of patience. Slow and steady, it makes this totally worth it. And this, by the way, I set this at 100. This size is 100. We want the opacity to be 100%, and this is going to say brush on the eraser side. I forgot to show you that, sorry. So now we sort of have a little bit of a more natural freehand torn brush. And if you create a clipping mask here, layer, create clipping mask, that looks a little bit more hand torn, right? Now what do I need to do? I need to show my my white paper underneath. So again, Control or Command J to duplicate that layer. Click on the bottom one, the one that's underneath, Control or Command T to get the transform handles. And now we want to click and drag on the outside and pull this white layer out just a tiny bit. Again, if you have the warp tool, you can get even a little more crazy. Image transform warp, and you can control just a little bit more pieces of it without doing the whole thing. So we want to push this in a little bit, pull that out a little bit, and there you've got your torn heart. If you like this tutorial, I hope you give me a thumbs up. Be sure to leave any comments or questions below, and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss any other digital scrapbooking tutorials. Thanks for watching.